chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening! You're listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark. Welcome, dear listeners, to Season 16, Episode 11. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and here as well is my neighbor, Malcolm Blackwood.
Hello, dear listeners. I hope you are well this evening.
And in this episode, we'll be performing 5 tales to terrify you, courtesy of authors Nicky, Exposito, Groshek, McCool, and Corpse Child. Tonight, we will hear stories of the fiendishly folkloric. You're listening to the standard edition of tonight's program, which contains the first 3 spine-tingling stories. If you'd like to show your support and enjoy an extended version of this and other episodes with twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today. Thank you for your support.
Your support is most deeply appreciated, and nothing warms our cold, unmoving hearts quite so much as providing more terror than you can take in one sitting.
Now, it's time to take a walk together down the moonlit trail, so lock your doors, turn your lights down low, and settle in. The show is about to begin. Evening. What is it you have there?
A book of old fairy tales. Very interesting. Do you realize that most of these classic tales for children involve something trying to eat them? Either being eaten is one of the scariest things that can happen to a child, or these authors were a lot hungrier than we want to admit.
Well, not all folklore comes from fairy tales. No matter how civilized we think we are, or how far we've come from those early days, we still have shadows lurking around us all the time, hiding whatever your imagination is capable of conjuring up.
Well, allow me to take a look. Yes, that corner over there. Definitely something fiendish hiding in that shadow of a rocking chair. That will definitely trouble my sleep. Excellent idea. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to be of assistance. By the way, if folklore is your thing, I believe I have quite the story for you.
Do you now? Well, I'll just sit down in this here shadowy rocking chair and take a listen.
Yes, indeed. Well, for this one, let's go to a large American city where almost anything can crawl out of the shadows. New York.
I'm already getting chills. I wonder if that pizza rat is still around. I hope so, though I assume it would have to be a rodent of very unusual size by now.
Well then, listen to this story from Nicky Exposito about a devastated bartender, ghostly apparitions, and a boat that always seems to show up at the worst possible time. Without further ado, I present to you the ghost ship of the Hudson River. She didn't know if it was the wind that woke her that night or the mysterious piping music that seemed to sound when the walls between worlds wore thin. 9-year-old Kendall jerked awake, drenched in sweat, at 3 a.m. on an October school night. She climbed out of bed and padded to her window. Past her backyard in a line of fir trees, she could see the serrated darkness of the Hudson River as it ambled lazily toward the Atlantic Ocean. Kendall had spent many a lazy day watching boats as they made their way up and down the river, a charming perk of her Hudson Valley childhood. She'd seen the container ships and barges and pusher tugs, the yachts and passenger vessels. But she'd never seen anything like the ship passing by that night, gliding leisurely south. The boat looked like one of the pirate ships she'd seen in illustrations. It had a broad wooden body, 2 masts like telephone poles, and billowing white sails. On either side of its pointing bowsprit were wooden carvings of strangely alluring monsters, women with wide-set eyes, flowing hair, and tentacles instead of legs. One she-creature smiled, the other bared her teeth. No flag flew from the ship's mast. Fascinated, Kendall watched. Then, fear cut her like the lash of a whip. The ship wasn't sailing on the water. Rather, it floated above the river as though sailing through the air. Terrified, Kendall dove back into bed, buried herself under her covers, and faced the wall, her back to the window and the river. She clenched her eyes shut until sleep came. The next afternoon, it was on the news. A timber barge and its pusher sank the night before. Some mistake had been made. A fire broke out and then an explosion a few miles north of Kingston. The Coast Guard had begun recovering bodies. All 9 men on board were thought to be dead. The ghost ship of the Hudson flies no flag, and it has no name. If it once had a destination, that destination was forgotten long ago. The ghost ship drifts, slowly but purposefully, up and down the Hudson River, from the Adirondacks to the mouth of the Atlantic Ocean, eternally. Its crew is comprised of individuals who once sailed the Hudson in another vessel, whose voyage was cursed, and who died in the river's watery embrace. The ship is invisible. It belongs to another plane of existence. When it's seen by an individual of extraordinary sensitivity, it should be considered an omen. Sometimes, the ghost ship hungers for a new crew member. It chooses its quarry from a vessel, any vessel, a yacht or schooner, fishing vessel or tugboat, floating along the Hudson. Some say the ghost ship chooses only the pure of heart. Others, those who truly belong on the water, or the conflicted, or the ones most beset by mental turmoil. By one method or another, the quarry is marked. This individual will see the ghost ship. They'll inform their fellow passengers or crewmates of the sight, an old wooden clipper with 2 masts and white sails that floats above the river like an apparition, but they will not be taken seriously. Then, an emergency. Their vessel will catch fire, or strike an obstacle, or experience mechanical failure. It'll never reach the shore. Most aboard are fated to drown in the black, polluted waters, and survivors never receive an adequate explanation for their trauma. Waterlogged bodies are recovered and accounted for. All except for one. As the wreckage is cleared, invisible to the living, the ghost ship continues its endless voyage, with one more unlucky soul aboard. Nearly 30 years after she spied the ghost ship through her bedroom window, Kendall stared into the inky depths of the Hudson River, this time up close, as little waves broke against the dock between Piers 82 and 83 in Manhattan. She wondered what it would feel like to plunge into the icy water. First, paralyzing cold, then the comforting weight embracing her body like a blanket, carrying her home. Since that night, Kendall both feared water and felt herself drawn to it. She swam competitively as a teenager, and she enjoyed submerging herself in the chlorinated pool, the water tamed and domesticated like an exotic pet. She tried surfing for a couple of months in college in Santa Barbara. The waves of the Pacific enticed her, their lulling repetition, knocking her about like a rubber duck, diving and bobbing. But since a near miss when she'd been caught in a riptide on Dockweiler Beach in Los Angeles, she'd shied away from the waves when they became too tall for comfort. Kendall placed a hand to her stomach, not protectively, not anymore. She resented her body, resented the particularly nasty joke it played on her. She threw her uniform shirt over her shoulder, turned away from the water, and strode towards Pier 83, where the 6 small cruise ships owned by Liberty Charters bobbed and pulled against their tethers. She tried to get out of her shift that night, a bartending, floating dance party for some Moroccan house DJ. But Marissa, her supervisor, wouldn't let her off the hook. They'd booked 3 charters that evening. They were stretched thin as it was, and since Peter and Jenny quit, they couldn't afford to lose another bartender. If Kendall called out, Marissa would have no choice but to pull Layla, inexperienced Layla, at the second-floor bar all by herself, thrown to the drunken wolves. So Kendall came. She owed it to Layla, and besides, she intended to be by the Hudson that night anyway. She patted her purse. The pills rattled obediently in their little orange bottle. "Dude, try this. Too sweet?" Layla asked, shoving a cherry red cocktail into Kendall's hand. The river cruise ambled north along the Hudson between Inwood and Jersey. The initial bar rush had subsided. Outside on the second-floor sun deck, a DJ performed under a canopy, while partygoers, mostly girls, and gays in their 20s and 30s with a yuppie vibe, took designer drugs and sipped tequila sodas and swayed to the repetitive, otherworldly music in heels and sequins and see-through tops. While Kendall watched them, Layla had been inventing a cocktail with Casamigos Reposada and a squirt bottle of raspberry syrup she'd found in the fridge. Kendall hesitated. Then she remembered she no longer had a reason to stay sober and took a sip. She liked it. She tasted the tequila, but the raspberry and lime and cranberry juice masked the sickly sweet aftertaste that usually kept her away from that particular spirit. "Yeah, it's good," she said to Layla. Layla, a 24-year-old hijabi nursing student, gave Kendall a suspicious look. Too much lime or not enough? Try it yourself. Layla, a practicing Muslim, didn't drink, but she didn't consider sampling the concoction she came up with as technically drinking. Kendall, doubted God, was particularly thrilled with Layla enabling others to drink, whether or not she partook herself, but Layla's relationship with the Almighty wasn't any of her business. Kendall still called herself a Methodist, even as she routinely contradicted church teachings. For instance, she'd gotten pregnant out of wedlock. Layla shook her head. She smiled conspiratorially and beckoned for Kendall to come closer. "Ahmed and I haven't told many people yet," she whispered, "but we're expecting." Layla rested a dainty hand on her still flat stomach. Kendall resisted the urge to do the same. She kept a smile pasted on her face as Layla babbled on about ultrasounds and pregnancy subreddits and the 2-bedroom apartment they'd hoped to move into. But when Layla dashed away to use the bathroom, Kendall let her support older friend mask slide off like shedded skin. As she mixed margaritas for 2, giggling 20-somethings, tiny crop tops, and tight shorts hugging their perfect curves, Kendall fought the urge to pitch her Boston shaker into the river. She'd once been a careless young working girl who hit the nightlife with reckless abandon, her future a bright shining that hung in the air plump for the picking. She'd moved with friends to Los Angeles after graduating from film school. She worked as a camera PA with a moonlit gig at a equipment rental house. Sure, she was cakewalking her way towards her dream career, union cinematographer. Friday nights, she'd prowl Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood with her girl group, dancing on tables and shrieking as they ran from dive bar to burlesque club. Now, Kendall was a broken toy, damaged goods. After the half-dressed 20-somethings pranced away with their margaritas, Layla pushed back behind the bar, frowning. "Guys, I saw something weird out in the water," she said. "A boat. This whole boat, like the Flying Dutchman from the Pirates of the Caribbean. It had white sails and these creepy mermaids on the front. And, I don't know much about boats, but it looked like it was floating in the air, not the water." Neither second-floor cashier looked impressed. Devante leaned on his register, lanky arms hanging over the counter. Renata took a long swig of her watermelon Red Bull and tapped on her phone. "Probably a promotion for some awful movie," Renata said disinterestedly. "The company out of Chelsea Piers does tourist cruise on old-school clippers," Devante explained. "That's probably what you saw." Layla shrugged. "Maybe." Kendall remained silent. Memories flooded her consciousness like water through a burst dam. Girl Scout campfires, local legends, and the things she saw that night through her childhood bedroom window. She snatched a stock list, swiped Renata's lighter, and snuck out of the bar. Kendall stood at the railing of the first-floor stern deck, where the crew kept mops and buckets and lengths of rope and watched the twin jets of water set spinning by the boat's motors. She scrunched the stock list in her hand like a torch. She thought about prom night, about Rob Cockle, and involuntarily cringed. Rob Cockle hadn't exactly been her dream prom date, but she was friends with his sister and didn't want to be a wet blanket. So to prom she went, a night of half-hearted dancing, lukewarm finger food, and itching in her borrowed dress. Afterward, her group retreated to her friend Laura's family cabin, which backed out onto the Hudson to drink cheap vodka out of plastic cups. "You guys ever hear about the ghost ship of the Hudson?" Rob slurred. They all nodded. Everyone who had ever grown up in the Hudson Valley knew about the story of the ghost ship. "Well, Rob continued, if you offer your blood to the river, one of the ghost ship's phantom crew members will appear to you." Shuddering at the memory, Kendall pulled her sharp little bar knife out of its sheath and ran the blade over the palm of her hand. The pain was oddly comforting, a biting kiss. She gingerly clutched her paper torch in her injured left hand, blood dripping down her wrist, and with Renata's pilfered lighter in her hand, set it aflame. She extended the flaming sheet of paper over the edge of the railing, belching gray smoke, and allowed droplets of her blood to drip down into the deep purple water below. A sudden gust of wind cut through Kendall's thin jacket. It quelled the flame, then tore the entire makeshift torch from her hand. The burned sheet of paper danced in the air behind the boat before disappearing into the darkness. It didn't work. Kendall wasn't even surprised. Rob Cockle's dumb ritual hadn't summoned a river ghost on the prom night either. She turned and recoiled with a gasp. She wasn't alone. A guy stood at the other end of the deck, his back to Kendall. He'd longish auburn hair and a slender, sinewy figure. He dressed differently than the other partiers, in a stained white tunic and oversized denim overalls. Roadie for the DJ, perhaps? The man turned and locked eyes with Kendall. She caught her breath. He wasn't a he at all, but a young woman. She had a heart-shaped face, deep-set chocolate eyes, and an upturned nose. The baggy man's shirt she wore couldn't hide her large breasts, or the slight convex bulge of her belly. Kendall clenched her teeth. It was like that time she'd gone on an AC bowl kick. All of a sudden, everywhere she looked, there was yet another shop selling AC bowls. No, it was a pregnant woman. Pregnant women at Starbucks and on the subway, and waiting in line behind Kendall at the market. First Layla, now this chick. Took a breath and forced herself to smile reassuredly. "Hey," she said, going to the pregnant girl's side. "Are you okay?" The girl studied her wordlessly. Kendall laid her hand on the girl's arm and immediately pulled back. She was freezing cold. "You should go inside," Kendall said comfortingly. "You're like ice." She looked critically at the sky, clear earlier, now crisscrossed by menacing clouds. "And it looks like it's going to rain." The girl didn't respond, but she didn't fight as Kendall tugged her by the wrist to the first-floor concession stand. The concession stand was quiet. Only a few partiers hung around the lower deck, staring at their phones or relaxing in folding chairs. Raoul, the first-floor bartender, sat on an overturned milk crate behind his register. "Hey, Raoul," Kendall said, "can you get me a hot chamomile tea? It's for the pregnant lady." Raoul frowned suspiciously. "Please, man," she insisted, "just a tea. I'll put it down as my employee meal." "Sure, I'll get you a tea," Raoul said nonchalantly. "You don't have to say it's your employee meal, but what pregnant lady are you talking about?" "The girl," Kendall turned. Her voice caught in her throat. The pregnant woman in overalls had vanished. Kendall considered as she jogged down the back stairs whether she should warn the crew they were staring down imminent danger. Layers of dark clouds obscured the sky, and the boat's usually gentle course up and down the river was becoming uncharacteristically choppy. Layla had seen the ghost ship. That meant disaster was predetermined. But what would she tell them? Hey guys, so the other bartender thinks she saw a clipper ship floating on top of the waves, and it sounds a whole lot like this camp story that gets kicked around my hometown. So I think we should head back to the pier before the boat sinks and or blows up. Even in her head it sounded ridiculous. Kendall found her leaning on the railing of the outdoor bow deck on the first floor, staring pensively into the dark river. She came up beside the pregnant ghost girl. "You were a crew member?" she asked. "Of the ghost ship?" The ghost girl gave her an unreadable look. "Well," Kendall said, trying to sound confident, "you have to talk to me. I'm the one who called you." She extended her injured hand. "I gave my blood to the Hudson. So as long as blood flows from my wound, you've got to answer my questions, honestly." The ghost girl studied Kendall as though she were the least interesting specimen she'd ever laid eyes upon, and then she spoke. "I suppose," she said. Her voice was low and gravelly with a hint of an Irish accent. "The ghost ship wants Layla, right?" Kendall asked, getting right to the point. The ghost girl nodded. "Why? Why did the ship choose her?" "I chose her," the ghost girl said, "because she fascinates me, and it's my turn to choose." "She's pregnant," Kendall said accusingly. "She doesn't look it yet, but—" "I know," the ghost girl replied without a hint of sympathy. Kendall took a deep breath. "I want you to take me instead." The ghost girl looked Kendall up and down, her brown eyes appraising her slightly out-of-shape form. "No," the ghost girl said, and she turned away. Kendall pushed down the familiar feeling of rejection. "Well, why? Why don't you want me?" "Because you're faded," the ghost girl said. Neither pity nor scorn in her voice. "The one I desire thrums with vitality." Faded. Tears stung Kendall's eyes. She'd felt that way for months, as though the color and texture were draining from her, leaving an empty space behind. Once she thrummed with vitality, She remembered her going-away party 2 weeks before her 30th birthday at the Argyle in Hollywood, how she'd swigged vodka out of the bottle and kissed strangers and danced the night away. She was celebrating her new job with Harvest Moon Digital in New York City, an agency that produced commercials and promotional materials, and her impending move to the city that never sleeps. The thought of shooting corporate videos hadn't exactly thrilled Kendall, but she'd be behind the camera every day, and the lady who interviewed her promised the occasional music video. So Kendall threw herself into the job. She threw herself into New York City, exploring the avenues late at night. Then came the buyout, and then the pink slip. The new corporate overlords laid off 80% of the Harvest Moon staff. They claimed they needed new blood, that their content had gone stale. Stale. Kendall herself was stale. And 6 months of sending her resume to anyone who would accept it, netting her 3 first interviews and 0 job offers, hadn't done anything to improve her shattered self-esteem. No one wanted to hire a 37-year-old videographer. So she gave up and started her own small business shooting event videos. Weddings paid well, and bartending provided extra money on the side. Kendall's income remained stable, but it felt like a step down, like she'd hit her peak and begun to slide. She sighed. The ghost girl clearly had no empathy for Layla or her baby, and she wasn't remotely impressed by Kendall's self-sacrifice. Kendall looked at her left hand. The blood still flowed, but not as freely. "What's your name?" she asked the ghost girl. "Ada," the girl said. "Ada Frawley." "That's a pretty name. When, if you don't mind me asking you, did you die, I guess?" "March 15th, 1918. "Oh." Kendall didn't comment on the fact that this chick had been haunting the river for over 100 years. Where were you going? And was your baby's dad, your husband, with you?" Ada stood silently for a moment, staring intently into the distance. Kendall saw a sudden flash of lightning in the distance. A raindrop brushed her cheek, then another. "I was traveling to Bookland," Ada said finally. "I had no husband. I met Edgar at the country manor where we were both employed. Me in the kitchen, him tending to the horses. He told me he loved me, promised we'd marry soon. It was only after my monthly bleeding didn't come that he informed me he was already married. He wanted to get rid of it. The baby. He said his aunt knew how." "I'm so sorry," Kendall said. Christ, she thought. This Edgar ass is even worse than Andrew. Andrew, freaking Andrew. Andrew had never made Kendall's heart dance or her loins cry out to the heavens. She had never felt what her friends, who liked dating, said that they felt for the losers they continuously fell for. Kendall couldn't stand dating or relationships, but she wanted children, and she wanted her children to have a father. So she made an OkCupid profile and matched with Andrew, 43, who worked in consulting. The first time they met, she and Andrew walked from Williamsburg to Crown Heights, talking and laughing the entire time. Kendall thought she'd found the cheat code to coupled bliss. They became serious quickly. They stopped using protection. The red flags, his condescending comments, his quick temper, his baseless accusations, were no match for Kendall's screaming biological clock. "My cousin found me a job in Brooklyn," Ada continued. "So I dressed as a boy, and my brother arranged for my passage on the coal ship Cressida, and..." She didn't finish her sentence. She didn't need to. She'd been chosen. Someone had done to her what she was about to do to Layla. "I'm pregnant too," Kendall said. The words twisted her heart. Ada sneered. "There's no child in your womb. Only an empty hole." An empty hole. A cheap imitation. A cruel prank played on Kendall by her own body. The 2 lines on the pregnancy test had been the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She danced to CVS for prenatal vitamins, filled her refrigerator with fruit and vegetables and lean meats, began Googling cribs and strollers, and imagining a wardrobe filled with tiny clothes. All of her insecurities about her job, her body, her professional peak and drop melted away as she embraced the identity of mother. She began noticing parks and museums and daycares, fantasized about walking down Fifth Avenue hand in hand with her chubby toddler. She wondered what her child would look like. Would they have her tan skin and wavy black hair? Or perhaps Andrew's strong jaw and icy blue eyes? Maybe they'd be a theater kid, like she'd been, or a Star Wars nerd, like Andrew was. They'd play soccer or join the band, or be obsessed with amphibians, have a part-time job at the Times Square Olive Garden, or win creative writing competitions, or go to college and study criminology. The seed-sized being snug in her womb was a tiny ball of endless possibilities. Then, her first ultrasound, the doctor's kind voice. "Are you sure you're 8 weeks along? The sac only looks like 6. There's no evidence of fetal growth. I'm sorry." The doctor called it a blighted ovum, an embryonic pregnancy. Andrew's sperm had impregnated her egg, and the egg had implanted itself in her uterus. The gestational sac, the container in which her baby would grow, developed. But no baby had formed. Instead of a ball of endless possibilities, she carried inside her an empty hole. Her life, once glittering with hope and anticipation, became colorless and cold. Andrew called her poor gynecologist to demand her medical records, insisting she prove she hadn't had an abortion behind his back, because that's what women do. She blocked his number and cut him out of her life. She'd been given a choice: take the pills or wait for nature to take its course. The world lost its wonder, and Kendall felt herself becoming furious at the world. The world that insisted on parading cheerful, pregnant women in front of her, like Layla. Layla with her youthful glow and her adorable nerd husband, and her shimmering future. The boat hit a large wave, throwing Kendall against the rail. The rain began to fall freely. She stared at Ada, who watched the water. And she knew. "You don't want Layla because she fascinates you," she said to Ada. "You want her because you're jealous. She gets to have a baby and you're stuck like this forever." Ada whirled. The wrath on her pretty face convinced Kendall she'd hit the nail on the head. "Well," Kendall ventured, "I think you're going about this the wrong way. Maybe somehow. Do you ever see a white light? Or maybe you have some unfinished business, or—" "Of course I see the white light," Ada snapped. "I've seen it every day. Every day for 100 years. Then, I don't get it. Go into the light. Set yourself free." "You think I've never thought of that?" Ada's dark eyes burned. "I wasn't chosen. Someone else was. Our boat capsized, and I was bleeding, and the water was so cold, and I felt myself sinking under, and I saw the light. I felt myself pulled into it. So I did what you're attempting to do. I begged. I begged the ghost ship to take me instead, because if I'd gone into that white light, my baby couldn't go with me." "Your baby," Kendall murmured. Ada nodded. "I felt my baby disappearing from my womb, and I knew if I followed the light into the world beyond this one, I'd go there alone." The boat shook again. Fat drops of water flew in Kendall's face, and she understood. She had the pills, misoprostol and mifepristone. They sat on her kitchen counter, instructing her to swallow them to clean out her womb, to free herself from the empty hole in her belly. But she couldn't. Her baby didn't exist, but she couldn't let go of the possibilities, of the fantasies about birthdays and Christmases and graduations, of the swirling ball of potential within her. So she bought herself another bottle of pills, sedatives. They were in her purse now, waiting for her return to the dock. That night, she'd walk to a quiet spot along the Hudson. She'd swallow the sleeping pills until they made her sick. She'd climb over the railing and she'd fall into the river, allowing its cold weight to pull her under. She'd give herself over to the ambling waters she'd watched from her childhood bedroom, and she, like her non-existent child, would dissolve into a billion little pieces. "Your child belongs with the Hudson," she muttered. Ada's face crunched. "What?" Kendall hadn't realized she'd spoken aloud, but her words had obviously touched something. "Do you know," she said carefully, "that the Hudson River empties into the Atlantic Ocean, and that actually all oceans are connected?" "Yeah, I know that," Ada snapped. "Just 'cause I'm a low class doesn't mean I'm an idiot. What's that got to do with anything?" "Well, Kendall stuttered. "Okay, how about this? You had dreams for your baby, right? You thought about what they would look like in the future." Beyond the Jersey shore, Kendall saw another burst of lightning, this one closer and larger. She felt her stomach drop as the boat took a dive, grasping the railing to keep her balance. When she straightened, Ada was staring up at the hazy sky. "I was going to call her Juliet," Ada said. "Oliver if it was a boy, but I wanted a girl. I'd have worked so hard she could take dance lessons, or piano. I always wanted to play an instrument when I was young, but my parents couldn't afford it." Kendall nodded. She smiled. She stared, enchanted at tiny ballet slippers as well. A loud clap of thunder sounded. There were fearful cries from the upper decks. "And I was going to save my money," Ada continued, "to send her to school. Teacher's college, maybe. She's going to have her own career, her own prospects, so she'd never have to depend on some lout of a man for her security." Another rumble of thunder. The boat jerked violently. Overhead, the music abruptly cut off. The rainfall became faster, thicker. Kendall shielded her eyes with one arm against the downpour. She took a breath. Absent-mindedly, she put her hand to her stomach, to the empty hole contained within. The cheap imitation. Her little ball of endless possibilities, trapped forever in stasis. "Your baby is trapped," Kendall said. Ada's eyes narrowed. Her smooth skin, impervious to the rain, seemed to blanch. But she didn't argue. She didn't push back. The gash on Kendall's hand still leaked slender streams of fresh blood, but it was clotting fast. Her time was running out. "You're not trapped alone on this boat," she continued. "Your baby is stuck here with you. And I don't think that's her destiny. I think she's meant to flow with the river to the ocean, because I think the ocean's the only thing big enough to hold her. One water molecule for every life she could have lived, every person she could have been." The boat tipped perilously. Kendall was tossed back onto the cold, hard deck. She landed in a puddle, catching herself on her injured hand, sending a wave of pain through her core. There were many frantic voices above her now, male and female, partier and crew. Kendall knew how their night would end, with a horrible accident, bodies floating in the Hudson. One body never recovered, that of pregnant, promising Layla, who would belong to the ghost ship for eternity. When she regained her footing, Ada was as she had been, bent over the railing as though she were a contented lover on a sunny day. But her pensive, pained expression had changed. Kendall saw tears in her pretty eyes. "Your baby, Juliet, is supposed to be playing with penguins in Antarctica now," she told Ada, allowing her imagination to run wild. "Hanging out with surfers in Brazil or cute otters in Alaska. And then water becomes vapor, and vapor travels on air, and people and animals breathe it in. So Julia would be a part of everything. She would experience everything. All the lives, all the possibilities, forever. The boat bucked again. A fresh shudder of pain cut through Kendall's body. This time it came from inside her stomach. Then the pain kept going. Reverberating tremors that felt like her uterus was being torn in half, ebbing and flowing like waves, each crest more powerful than the last. Kendall collapsed to her knees. She felt the warm wetness trickle down her thighs. Kendall miscarried in the crew bathroom on the first deck. She vomited yellow bile to the stained metal toilet, crouched on her hands and knees, lay curled on the dirty floor as the cutting pain rippled through her. She sat on the toilet and felt the blood drain from her body, thick clots collecting at the bottom of the bowl, then couldn't keep her body upright and collapsed back to the ground, crying and trembling and sweating, the concrete floor never cold enough. She didn't notice the sea calming, the boat's sharp movements smoothing, the cease of the rain against the windows, the restored music upstairs. Hours later, maybe, there was a knock on the door. Kendall summoned the energy to pull herself to her feet and turn the knob. It was Layla and a pair of female co-workers. They hadn't seen Kendall since before that freak storm, and they were worried about her. They brought her a change of clothes, towels to wipe the blood off the floor, Tylenol, a bandage for her cut hand, and a tiny olive jar where Kendall could keep the tiny, fragile gestational sac agonizingly expelled from her body. Soon after, the boat docked at Pier 83. Damp revelers stumbled away in various states of drunkenness. Kendall's pain had subsided enough she was able to walk off the boat herself. Lila insisted on driving her back to Brooklyn. While she waited at the dock for her coworker to pull around, Kendall stared yet again into the endless depths of the Hudson River. She dug through her purse and extracted the bottle of sedatives, found a trash can and dumped them all in. Then she returned to the water's edge. She clutched the tiny jar in her hands, the makeshift urn for the gestational sac, her little black hole. She marveled that a thing so small and fragile could be a vehicle for all the possibility that lived in her head, or for such anguish. She undid the lid, pulled out the jelly-like sack, and flung it into the gurgling darkness. Her child, all the children that could have been, belonged with the eternally churning river. "I love you," she whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't be your mom." Beyond her, unseen, the ghost ship of the Hudson sailed silently onward. No flag, no destination, no name. Except that night, it sailed with one less unfortunate soul on board. Now, folks, I've got some thrilling news for you. If you've been enjoying the chills and thrills of scary stories told in the dark, you'll want to check out my brand new show, Otis Jiry's Nightmare Fuel. It's a little different from what you're used to. This time, I'm inviting you to join me around the campfire at Camp Duskwood, right on the shores of Twilight Lake. It's an immersive, interactive experience where you'll feel like you're right there with me, swapping tales in the shadows. And these aren't just any stories. On Nightmare Fuel, I'm narrating tales I've never performed before. Brand new takes from rising authors, fresh spins on classic horror, and a few timeless legends that'll stick with you long after the fire's gone out. The show's just debuted, and there's already several spine-tingling episodes waiting for you to binge. Plus, every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern, a new story is added to the flames. You can find Otis Jiry's Nightmare Fuel on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. So, if you're ready for something a little different, come join me by the fire. The stories are dark, the fire's warm, and there's always room for one more camper. I hope you enjoyed The Ghost Ship of the Hudson River by Nicky Exposito as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Nicky-Exposito. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/NICKY-EXPOSITO. Lovers of urban horror will find many delightful stories from Nicky, as previously read on this program. And of course, don't miss the story contained in the podcast, The Burned Note, 2 seasons now available to listen to. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author. And if you are watching on YouTube and are enjoying this episode, please give a like and a comment, and be sure to spread the word on your favorite social media. Listeners like you are how we keep this place going, and we appreciate each and every one of you.
How ironic to have a bartender keep everyone from dropping into the drink.
Now that you mention it.
But I have one I've just recalled as well. Mr. Craig Groshek has scared up another wondrous tale. This one, a stretch of road, a series of accidents, and a force that just won't keep its hands to itself. Settle down and settle in as I tell you the tale of The Hairy Hands of Briar's Bend. When I moved back to my hometown, I thought I'd put the worst of my bad luck behind me. Losing my job, my marriage, and most of my savings had been enough for 1 year. The slow pace of the Midwest, with its endless fields and quiet roads, seemed like the cure. What I didn't know was that some things are better left undisturbed, and that Briar's Bend was one of them. The road itself didn't look like much. A narrow, winding strip of asphalt cutting through the dense woods on the outskirts of town. The kind of place you'd take to save 10 minutes on a long drive if you weren't paying attention. It didn't even have streetlights, just the occasional reflective sign that blinked at you from the dark. I first heard about the road from Hank Sullivan, my neighbor. Hank was the kind of guy who could talk for hours about nothing, always ready with a story or two about the town. One evening, after I'd unpacked most of my boxes, Hank leaned over the fence with a beer in his hand and a conspiratorial grin on his face. "You ever hear about Briar's Bend, Caleb?" he asked, clearly eager to share. I hadn't, but I humored him. "Should I have?" "It's got a reputation," he said, his grin fading. "People say it's cursed. Drivers lose control for no reason, even on clear nights. Some folks say it's bad luck. Others—" He paused, glancing around as if the trees might be listening. "They say it's the hairy hands." I laughed, but Hank didn't join in. "The hairy hands?" "Disembodied hands," he said, lowering his voice. "Come out of nowhere and grab the wheel or the handlebars if you're on a bike. They force you off the road. Legend has it they even made horse-drawn carriages crash back in the day." "And people believe this?" I asked incredulously. "They do. Enough that most won't take that road after dark. You shouldn't either." I rolled my eyes but thanked him for the warning. Hank had grown up here, and I figured he was just repeating one of those small-town campfire stories. I didn't believe in curses or ghost stories, especially ones about phantom hands. That changed a few weeks later. It was a Wednesday night, and I'd gone to visit a friend in the next town over. The drive back was supposed to be easy, but I'd left later than planned, and the interstate was closed for construction. My GPS, smug and indifferent, rerouted me down Briar's Bend. The name didn't register until I was already on it. The road was darker than I expected. My headlights lit the asphalt ahead, but the trees on either side crowded in so tightly they looked like walls. The night was quiet, too quiet, with no other cars in sight. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I approached a curve, the kind that begged for caution. That's when it happened. The wheel wrenched hard to the right, as if someone had yanked it from my hands. I shouted, instinctively pulling back, but the force was overwhelming. My knuckles went white as I fought to keep the car on the road, the tires skidding against loose gravel. The sensation was impossible to describe. There was nothing visible. No hands, no figure, but I felt it. A forceful, bone-deep pressure on my own hands, like someone's fingers were wrapped around mine, forcing me to turn. I managed to wrestle the wheel back under control just in time to avoid slamming into the guardrail. The car screeched to a stop, and I sat there, breathing hard, doing my best not to hyperventilate. For a moment, I couldn't move. The rational part of my brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe the steering column had locked up, or the road was slicker than I'd thought. But none of that explained the feeling, the undeniable sensation of something stronger than me trying to take over. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaky, and looked around. The woods was still, the road empty. There was no sign of another driver, no indication of what had just happened. My hands trembled as I ran them over the steering wheel, searching for something, anything, to make sense of what I'd just experienced. But there was nothing, just the faint impression of pressure lingering on my skin. I got back in the car and drove home, keeping my speed well below the limit. The whole time, I couldn't stop glancing at the wheel, half expecting it to jerk again. When I pulled into the driveway, Hank was out on his porch, nursing another beer. He waved, his grin as lazy as ever. I thought about telling him what had happened, but stopped myself. What was I supposed to say? That the hairy hands had almost killed me? Instead, I gave him a nod and went inside, locking the door behind me. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The jerking wheel, the invisible grip. It didn't feel like something I could just brush off. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than a mechanical fluke, but every time I replayed it in my head, the memory felt sharper and more vivid. And then there was that pressure. My hands had tingled for hours afterward, like phantom fingers were still wrapped around them. Hank noticed something was off. He stopped me one morning while I was heading out to grab groceries. "You sure are looking jumpy," he said, leaning against the fence with his usual beer in hand. "You all right?" I hesitated, debating whether to tell him. The last thing I wanted was for Hank to think I was buying into his ghost stories. "I took Briar's Bend the other night," I admitted finally. Hank froze mid-sip, his expression sharpening. "At night?" I nodded, trying to play it cool. "It wasn't a big deal, but something happened, didn't it?" He set the beer down, crossing his arms like a parent ready to scold a reckless kid. I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I guess the wheel jerked or something. Probably hit a bad patch of road." "Sure," Hank said, though his tone was anything but convinced. "A bad patch of road, that's what everyone says, until it happens again." I laughed, a weak, humorless sound. "Come on, Hank. You're not seriously blaming the hairy hands for this, are you?" "All I'm saying is, people don't wreck on that road because they're bad drivers. Something out there doesn't want folks passing through. You'd do well to leave it alone." Hank's warning stuck with me no matter how much I wanted to dismiss it. I started digging into the town's history, hoping to find some explanation that didn't involve disembodied hands. The library was my first stop, a small single room in the back of the community center. But Mrs. Lowry, the librarian, was thrilled that someone was interested in local lore. "I've got some newspaper clippings somewhere," she said, shuffling through a file cabinet. "Briar's Bend has always had a reputation." She handed me a stack of yellowed articles, and I started sifting through them. Most were decades old, filled with grim accounts of accidents along the road. The language was eerily consistent. Lost control, swerved for no apparent reason, crashed into the ravine. One article from the 1950s caught my attention. It described a local farmer who claimed an unseen force had ripped the reins from his hands, sending his horse-drawn cart tumbling into the ditch. The man survived, but his account was dismissed as hysteria. Then there was a more recent piece from the 1980s. A truck driver swore something grabbed his steering wheel, forcing his rig into the trees. He barely escaped with his life. The reporter had labeled it driver fatigue, but the man insisted he wasn't tired. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. This wasn't just one or two stories. It was a pattern stretching back nearly a century. I started asking around, talking to anyone who'd listen. Most people dismissed the accidents as a mix of bad luck and poor road maintenance. But a few, mostly older folks, leaned in close and whispered their own theories. One woman claimed the road was cursed by a settler who'd been lynched for practicing witchcraft. Another said it was built on the land of a violent farmer who'd killed his family before being run down by vigilantes. "The hands are him," one old man insisted, his voice a low rasp. "He's still out there, grabbing at folks who get too close to his land." It was all a little too dramatic for my taste, but it planted a seed of doubt. What if there was something to these stories, something more than just superstition? By the time I left the library, I had the distinct impression that I'd stepped into something far older and darker than I'd realized. The more I thought about the hairy hands, the more restless I became. I didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but there was something about the stories, so many of them, stretching back decades, that I couldn't ignore. I told myself I was just curious, that I needed to see the road again in the daylight, maybe find some logical explanation. But deep down, I knew better. It was a clear night when I made the decision. I hadn't planned it. I just found myself grabbing my keys and heading out. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Either way, I knew exactly where I was going. Briar's Bend. The road looked different this time. In the dark, with no other cars around, it felt alive. My headlights cut through the blackness, bouncing off the narrow asphalt and the dense wall of trees on either side. My hands tightened on the wheel as I approached the first curve. Nothing happened at first. I kept my speed steady, focusing on the road ahead. But then, the radio suddenly cut out. At first, I thought it was just a signal issue. Static crackled faintly before fading into silence, and I reached for the dial to adjust it. That's when the steering wheel jerked. It wasn't subtle this time. The wheel wrenched violently to the left, creating enough friction to burn my palms. My heart leaped into my throat as I fought to steady the car, the tires skidding across the gravel-strewn shoulder. The sensation was unmistakable. The same overwhelming pressure, the same invisible grip, stronger and more deliberate than before. My arms strained against the force, muscles burning as I struggled to regain control. "Not again," I said through clenched teeth, my voice shaking. The car veered toward the edge of the road, the guardrail looming in the headlights. I slammed on the brakes, but the hands didn't let up. It was like they were driving, not me. At the last second, the wheel twisted sharply and the car spun out. The tires screeched, sending gravel flying in every direction, and I crashed nose first into a tree. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and my head hit the steering wheel hard enough to leave me dazed. That's when I realized my airbags hadn't deployed. For a moment, I wondered if the hands had anything to do with it. I fumbled with the door handle and stumbled out of the car, coughing from the acrid smell of burnt rubber. The night air was cold against my skin, and my head throbbed where it had struck the wheel. And it wasn't over. One moment, I was standing there trying to calm my nerves. The next, they were on me. I didn't even hear them coming. The pressure wrapped around my throat like a vise, cutting off my air. My hands clawed at my neck instinctively, but there was nothing to grab, nothing to fight. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. Cold, crushing, and unrelenting. My vision blurred, and my knees buckled as I sank to the ground. Panic surged through me, but it was useless. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. Deprived of oxygen, the world around me began to fade, darkness closing in. I thought for one horrifying moment that this was it. I was about to be added to Miss Lowry's pile of newspaper clippings. Then I heard the hum of an engine. Headlights swept over the road, growing brighter as a semi-truck rumbled around the bend. The pressure vanished as suddenly as it had come, leaving me gasping for air. I collapsed onto the asphalt, coughing and clutching my neck, my lungs burning. The truck screeched to a stop, and a woman's voice called out, "Hey, are you okay?" I tried to answer, but my throat was raw. The words caught somewhere between a sob and a gasp. The trucker, a tall, sturdily built woman with an austere expression, jumped down from the cab and hurried over. "What the hell happened here?" she demanded, looking from me to the wrecked car. I shook my head, unable to speak. What could I even say? That a pair of invisible hands had tried to murder me? "Can you stand?" she asked, pulling me to my feet. I nodded weakly, leaning heavily on her arm as she guided me toward the truck. She helped me into the passenger seat and handed me a bottle of water. As we drove away, she glanced at me, her eyes sharp, but not unkind. "You're lucky I came by when I did. People don't usually make it off this road in one piece." I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, clutching the bottle with shaking hands, and stare out at the dark woods as they disappeared into the distance. The rest of the drive back to town was a blur. I stared out the truck's passenger side window, clutching my water like a lifeline, my mind replaying the assault over and over. The merciless grip on my throat, the way the air had been stolen from my lungs. If that trucker hadn't come when she did, I wouldn't have made it. Marie Big Red Cartwright, as she introduced herself, had the air of someone who'd seen her share of trouble and didn't have time for nonsense. Her broad shoulders filled the cab, her thick hands gripping the steering wheel with an ease that made me envious. She didn't say much at first. She just kept glancing over at me with an expression that hovered between concern and mild irritation. "You sure you don't want me to take you to a hospital?" she asked eventually. I shook my head, my throat too inflamed to speak. The last thing I needed was a bunch of questions I couldn't answer, followed by looks of pity, or worse, disbelief. Marie sighed. "All right, but you ought to know this ain't the first time I've pulled someone off Briar's Bend. That road's trouble, plain and simple." I turned to look at her, wincing as the motion pulled at the bruises forming on my neck. "You've seen it?" I croaked. She shook her head. "Never seen it. But I've heard the stories. Truckers talk, you know. Weird crashes, drivers running off the road for no reason. Some say it's bad engineering, others say it's something else." Her hesitation told me she knew exactly what I was talking about, even if she didn't want to admit it out loud. "What do you think?" I rasped. She glanced at me, her expression guarded. "I think I've been on the road long enough to know there's things out there we're better off leaving alone. And Briar's Bend? That's one of those things." Marie dropped me off at my house just after midnight. I thanked her as best I could and watched her truck disappear into the darkness, her taillights winking out like a dying ember. The house felt too quiet when I stepped inside. Every shadow seemed deeper, each creak of the floorboards sharper. I locked the door behind me and slid the chain into place with trembling hands. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey and tried to piece together what had happened. My mind kept circling back to the same question. Why me? What had I done to deserve this? I hadn't provoked whatever was out there. I hadn't even believed in it. But the hands didn't care about belief. They didn't care about me at all. They were just there, malevolent, ruthless, and utterly indifferent to human logic. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going back to Briar's Bend, not ever. I didn't care if it was the shortest route to the next town or if someone dared me to take it again. Some things were worth avoiding. Over the next few months, I heard whispers about more accidents on the road. A motorcycle skidding off into the trees, a pickup flipping over on a sharp curve. The details were always the same. No apparent cause, no logical explanation. I kept my distance, but the town didn't let me forget. Hank would stop by now and then, always full of stories about the hands. "Did you hear about the Jenkins boy?" he said one afternoon, leaning over the fence with a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Wrecked his dad's Camaro on Briar's Bend. Said his hands were jerked clean off the wheel." I nodded, but didn't respond. I didn't want to encourage him. Hank squinted at me, his grin lopsided. "You got lucky, Caleb. Most folks don't walk away from that road." "I know," I said quietly. As the months went on, I tried to move on. I returned to work, started fixing up the house, and even joined a bowling league to pass the time. But the memory of that night never faded. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night clutching at my throat. Other times, I'd find myself avoiding dark roads altogether, even when I knew they were safe. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the hairy hands weren't real. But deep down, I knew the truth. They were out there, waiting. If you ever find yourself driving through a small, quiet town in the middle of nowhere, and someone warns you about a road like Briar's Bend, listen to them. Turn around. Take the long way home. Because the hands don't care who you are or what you believe. All they care about is pulling you off the road. And next time, there might not be a trucker coming around the bend to save you. I hope you enjoyed The Hairy Hands of Briar's Bend by Craig Groshek, as performed by your friendly neighbor, Malcolm Blackwood. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented feature author, you can help support them by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Craig-Groshek. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/CRAIG-GROSHEK. Craig Groshek is the creator and operator of the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, which has grown to nearly 500,000 subscribers, over 3,000 uploads, and more than 69 million video views in its 12 years of operation. He also oversees the production of 4 weekly audio horror fiction podcasts, faithfully adapting and featuring the work of thousands of indie horror authors. A published author himself, dozens of his short stories have been adapted to audio for the channel and other platforms. He holds a bachelor's degree in communication from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. In his free time, Groshek enjoys a wide range of outdoor activities, traveling and spending time with his 3 horror-loving children and close friends. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author.
You know, when people talk about taking the wheel, I don't think this is what they mean.
Really? It is for everyone I talk to. But then, the people I talk to tend to be on the twitchy side of things.
And that reminds me. What happened to that car of yours you bought not too long ago?
In the shop. It needs a lot of work for entirely unrelated reasons. But come now, surely you have another tale for the night.
Yeah, I have another story from McCool. We delve into Irish lore now with a man who discovers that being nice has its benefits and the opposite has its punishments. Without further ado, I present to you The Hunger Man. It's difficult for modern readers to appreciate the devastating impact that the Great Famine had upon Ireland during the years 1845 to 1852. The result of potato blight and British negligence, the famine, resulted in the starvation and deaths of 1 million souls and the migration of another 2 million in the years that followed. This was a demographic disaster from which Ireland hasn't fully recovered even to this day. But it's the human tragedy that's so hard to fathom. To think of the individuals, the families, and the communities who suffered so horribly and died in pain, terror, and hunger. There's no doubt that the famine has cast a dark shadow over the Irish nation and diaspora. But this story isn't about the tragic history of the 1840s, but rather my own encounter with a supernatural entity born out of those terrible times. A ghoul who stalks this green land and brings either good fortune or bad luck, depending on how one engages with him. The first time I met the Hunger Man was deep in the mountains of County Mayo on Ireland's west coast. I'd just finished my degree and so should have been celebrating with my fellow graduates in Dublin. But despite my academic success, this was not a good time for me. I was up to my eyes in student debt, had no job prospects on the horizon, plus my girlfriend of 2 years just dumped me. The stresses of city life were getting to me, so I decided to get away for the weekend, staying in a hostel in Castlebar while trekking the hills to the town's northwest. I was hiking through the Nephin National Park on a warm but overcast summer's day. This was a pristine wilderness of blanket bogs and mountainous terrain. Not the hardest of hikes, but not the easiest either, as my boots sank into the bog and I was plagued by annoying black flies. Nevertheless, I enjoyed the peace and solitude as I trekked over the barren hills and was hit by the cool wind of the wild Atlantic. I didn't encounter many other people during my walk. I saw the occasional hiker or tourist whilst I was on the trail, but as I trekked deeper into the wilderness, I soon realized I was alone. There was an eerie silence on that summer's afternoon. The land before me was beautiful but largely empty, as even trees are in short supply in this part of the country. It was indeed quiet, with hardly a sound carried in the wind other than the occasional distant bird call. I should have been at peace. That was why I'd come out here, after all, to escape the hustle and bustle of the big city. Instead, I felt very unsettled during this stage of my walk, paranoid even, as I had the constant feeling I was being watched, even though there wasn't a soul visible in any direction. I knew I should have headed back toward the marked trail, and yet something pushed me onward as I trudged through the wet bog and farther up the hillside. I spotted a structure in the distance, more a ruin, really. There were the remains of a small stone cottage, its thatched roof long gone, and its walls greatly reduced. Ruined cottages such as this were a common sight in the rural west of Ireland, reminders of a bygone era when destitute farmers had to eke out a living from the harsh land. I felt myself drawn to the structure for some reason, determined to reach the ruins no matter what. It was then that I heard the voices carried on the wind, faint at first, but growing ever louder, so much so that I could soon make out words and sentences. There were many disembodied voices coming from all around me, young and old, women and men, speaking in both Irish and English. They all cried out at once, the volume growing so loud that all other sounds were drowned out. I found it hard to understand the chilling messages given the chaotic din, but the phrases I did recognize were telling. "Help me! Please, God. So hungry. Damn you to hell. My body was trembling, and there were tears rolling down my cheeks. I don't think I've ever been so terrified in my life as the 100 ghoulish entities called out to me all at once. All my instincts told me to turn and run, but something even stronger pulled me forward. It defied all logic, but I knew I needed to get to the stone cottage as it was my only hope in this haunted land. I trudged forward, almost collapsing into the bog as I covered my ears with my hands in a futile attempt to drown out the terrible cacophony. I don't know how I made it, but somehow I struggled up the steep hillside and placed my shaking hand against the cold stone of the outer wall. As soon as I did so, the voices stopped. I mean, in a split second. The begging and disembodied cries of the ghouls abruptly ended, only to be replaced by the familiar and tranquil silence of the Irish countryside. I tried to regain some level of composure as I collapsed down against the stone wall, perspiring heavily and shaking almost uncontrollably as I took deep breaths. I didn't understand what had just happened to me. I began to remember some of the stories I'd heard from my grandfather when I was young, tall tales of Irish folklore, talk of leprechauns, fairies, banshees, and trapped spirits tied to the land. This island had seen so much suffering and death, both before and after the famine. Perhaps the land we walk upon has absorbed those tragedies, trapping the spirits of those who had died before their time and are not at peace. It seemed impossible, but I tried to keep an open mind in that moment as I lay against the wall and wearily looked down the hillside I'd just climbed. I'd just about managed to calm myself down before I heard a new voice from behind, which made me jump in fright. Excuse me, sir. May I trouble you for a moment?" I turned around in a state of panic and was startled by the figure who confronted me, standing just yards away on the far side of the crumbling wall. The man who addressed me was in a sorry state. That's an understatement, to be fair, as I don't think I've seen a human being who looked so close to death. He was of indeterminate age, his hair falling out and his teeth yellow and rotten. I couldn't help but notice how emaciated he was, appearing like little more than a skeleton with no meat on the bones. He looked so weak that I thought a mere gust of wind would blow him over. In fact, I was astonished he had enough strength to stand at all. His clothes were little more than soiled and torn rags which barely covered his emaciated form. When I observed his skin, I noted it was flaky and covered in unsightly sores, and there was an awful stench off of him. And finally, I was drawn to his sunken eyes that would break your heart, filled with sorrow, pain, and a terrible hunger. But what struck me most was how politely he'd addressed me, despite his desperate situation. I couldn't quite place his accent. It sounded Irish, but it was also unusual, like he was speaking out of his time. Although I was shocked by the man's appearance, I didn't consider him a threat. In fact, I felt sympathy for the sorry individual and wondered how he'd come to be in such a sorry state. I also realized that he'd asked me a question and I was yet to answer. Yes, mate," I said sheepishly. "How are you doing today?" The emaciated man managed to crack a smile through his bone-dry lips, showing his unsightly, rotten teeth while doing so. "Well, sir, I'll be honest. I've had better days, but I try to keep my spirits up." "Do you need help? Can I call you an ambulance?" I asked with concern. The man looked confused by the question, but he responded nonetheless. "All I need from you, good sir, is some food to quell my hunger. I will be forever grateful if you're able to share your bread with me." I thought for a moment before remembering the sandwich and flask of tea I was carrying in my backpack. It was meant to be for my lunch, but clearly this man's need was greater than mine. I smiled as I reached into my bag, withdrawing and unwrapping the sandwich and unscrewing the flask. I offered the food and drink to the starving man, seeing his eyes light up with ravenous yearning as he reached out with his bony hands. "Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you so much," the man replied emotionally before he took hold of the offerings and devoured them in short order. After he was done, the man returned my flask before sitting down on the grass against the wall, a satisfied smile on his face as he looked up into the cloudy sky. I was curious about the man's origins and how he'd come to be in such a bad condition. "Tell me, mate, are you from around these parts?" I inquired. The man nodded gently before answering. "Yes, sir, I am from here. My roots go back a long way. You could say I have a close affinity with the land, that I'm tied to it." He sighed deeply, making eye contact with me before continuing. "I've seen hard times over the years, there's no doubt about that. There is much selfishness and cruelty in this world. But there's still kindness. You've proven that to me, sir, on this fine day." He smiled again, his eyes brighter than before. I didn't know what to say or how to reply. Suddenly, I heard a noise from down the hillside, another voice in the wind, perhaps. I turned around to look in that direction, and when I turned back, the emaciated man was gone. I gasped in shock, the hairs on my neck standing on end as I jumped up and searched all around the small ruined cottage. But there was no sign of my mysterious companion. I looked in all directions across the empty and uninhabited land, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he'd never been there at all. That afternoon, spent in the hills of County Mayo, was certainly a freaky experience. I was still as white as a sheet by the time I trudged back to the trail and finally returned to my car. I couldn't make sense of the seemingly paranormal experience I'd been through, and so I chose to forget it and move on. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Well, the human brain has a strange way of rationalizing events that are beyond our conventional understanding. I told myself it was all in my head. I'd been under a lot of pressure, and my mind was likely playing tricks on me. I didn't believe in ghosts, ghouls, or fairy tales. How could I? I never entirely forgot about the bizarre incident that summer afternoon, but there was so much going on in my life that I put it on the back of my mind. The Hunger Man had wished me good fortune, and for a time, that's what I enjoyed. I received a surprise job offer soon after my return to Dublin, a job that was well paid. I got on top of my debt, moved into a plush apartment, and started a new and exciting relationship. My life was going well in almost every respect, but I'll admit that my success changed me. I got a promotion in my job, which meant more money, but also longer hours and greater responsibility. I was the manager over my department with the authority to hire and fire, and I'll confess that this power went to my head. I forgot about my previous situation and the struggles that I'd had with my finances, instead of throwing money around as I enjoyed the finer things in life. This was the context behind my second meeting with the Hunger Man, an unexpected reunion 3 years after our first encounter. I'll confess that a supernatural experience was the last thing I expected on the night in question. I'd been working late in the office, but had just finished for the evening. It was sometime after 10 p.m. on a chilling autumn night when I walked down O'Connell Street, and my intention was to have a nightcap in my members' club before getting a taxi home. Therefore, my thoughts were elsewhere as I strolled along the pavement, only to be interrupted by an oddly familiar voice from behind me. "Excuse me, good sir. Can I trouble you for a moment?" My initial instinct was to ignore the faint call and keep on walking. Dublin's city centre wasn't always the safest to walk through after dark, and there had been a surge in violent muggings in recent weeks. Nevertheless, I felt a chilling sense of déjà vu upon hearing that polite request spoken in a soft voice. My mind returned to the fateful afternoon in rural County Mayo, the bizarre incident which I had written off as a figment of my imagination. Surely it couldn't be happening again, I told myself. I should have kept walking, but instead I turned around and searched the dimly lit pavement. Looking down, I saw a familiar figure sitting cross-legged on the pavement just outside of a shop front. It was wrapped in blankets and a grubby old coat in an attempt to keep out the cold. Therefore, I couldn't see his body under the layers. But I did make out his thin face illuminated under the streetlights, his sunken eyes looking up at me in desperate hope. I stood there, frozen to the spot for a long moment as old memories flooded back. My heart told me this was the same man I had encountered 3 years ago, but my head told me it wasn't possible. And so I hardened my heart as I spoke down to the sorry-looking individual with barely concealed contempt in my voice. Yes, what do you want?" I asked curtly. The blanket-covered man didn't seem to notice my hostile tone, as he smiled faintly before replying, "Thank you for stopping, good sir. As you can see, I've fallen on tough times. I'm so very hungry and would appreciate greatly anything you can spare." I shook my head and laughed. I was now sure there wasn't a connection between the strange and probably imagined incident 3 years ago and the man lying on the pavement before me. Dublin is a city of haves and have-nots. There's a lot of wealth in the Irish capital, with multinational companies operating out of the city and young professionals like me making a good living. The cost of living and property prices are high. But of course, there's also an urban underclass, the homeless, drug addicts, and petty criminals. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I behaved very badly in that moment, treating this poor man like he was lesser than me. "I don't have any change," I said firmly. "And even if I did, why should I give it to you? I worked hard for my money, pal. Nobody ever gave me any handouts." The man's eyes narrowed as he spoke in a less friendly tone. "Good sir, I'm appealing to your Christian charity. It's been so long since I last ate." I snorted in contempt, my heart turning to stone as I answered him. "I don't believe it for a second. Do you think I'm an idiot? If I give you anything, you'll only spend it on drinks or drugs. Not a chance, my friend." Something changed in the Hunger Man's expression after I spoke those words. His smile faded, and the hope disappeared from his sullen eyes. I thought he might react with anger, but instead I saw nothing but disappointment and sad resignation. There was a tense pause before he shook his head and spoke out once again. "How disappointing. I had expected better from you, sir, especially given your generosity the last time we met. Alas, it seems you've forgotten your humanity." His reference to a previous meeting did give me second thoughts, but I remained stubborn, dismissing it all as a coincidence as I laughed in open mockery. "Whatever, mate. Good luck to you," I replied, before turning my back on the hungry man and continuing my walk down O'Connell Street. As you've probably already guessed, I had just made a terrible mistake. But still, I couldn't have predicted the consequences resulting from my rude snubbing of the hungry man. I'd only walked a few yards before my stomach started to rumble. I didn't think much of this, as I remembered I hadn't eaten since lunchtime, since I'd been tied up with work long into the evening. I changed my plans, intending to head straight home and order a takeaway once I got there. Therefore, I made my way toward the monument where I intended to hail a cab. But my situation soon deteriorated. Seemingly out of nowhere, I experienced intense hunger pains as my stomach began to ache. I nearly keeled over, feeling lightheaded as I struggled to stay on my feet. This was a frightening experience for sure, but I didn't yet succumb to panic. I rationalized the hunger in my mind, telling myself that I needed to take better care of my physical health, which meant eating properly and getting more sleep. This explanation would have made sense, except for what happened next. I became increasingly weak and dizzy as I struggled along the city street, the cold biting through me as I had difficulty taking in my surroundings. Several people passed me on the pavement, late-night shoppers and drinkers piling out of the bars. They all looked at me suspiciously, some with sympathy, but not one stopped or asked me whether I was okay. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I was scared. My condition was rapidly growing worse. I felt my heart beating fast in my chest, and my breathing became shallow, as every gasp for air became a painful struggle. By now I felt cold all over and was so very weak. I couldn't believe it when I looked down at my hands and saw my fingers were so thin, almost down to the bone. In fact, my clothes, my finely tailored dark suit and white buttoned shirt, they were literally hanging off me. But worse was to come as I stumbled in front of a shop window and was horrified by my own reflection in the glass. It took me a moment to recognize the man staring back at me. Such was my shock at the rapid change. My face was wafer thin and my skin pale and pasty, and my eyes were sunken and filled with an animal-like desperation. It was crazy, impossible even, but I was wasting away, having lost much of my body weight in a matter of seconds. My brain could not comprehend what was happening to my body. Everything hurt, and all my bodily functions were shutting down. Suddenly, my legs could no longer carry me, and I collapsed down to the paving stones like a sack of spuds. I tried to cry out and beg for help, but I couldn't form words, instead letting out a desperate, guttural cry. Looking to the far side of the street, I saw people staring at me, some shaking their heads in disgust before turning away. They must have thought I was a drunk or on drugs. Down and out beyond help. The irony wasn't lost on me, but by now I was fighting for my life. I could no longer walk, so I crawled. Where to, I couldn't say, but I wasn't prepared to simply give up. My clothes were now soiled and hanging off of me, and when I touched my body, I realized all my body fat had been eaten away, leaving just skin and bones. Everything hurt now. Every breath, every movement. It was complete agony. I couldn't take the pain any longer. I knew I wasn't far from the River Liffey, and my drastic plan was to throw myself into the icy waters to end my misery. I was that desperate. But thankfully I lacked the strength to make it to the river, instead collapsing down against the cold pavement before I lost consciousness, my tired eyes shutting as the darkness took me. I awoke in a hospital bed sometime during the early hours with no memory of how I'd got there. Panic almost overcame me as I tried to sit up, only to find an IV drip hooked into my arm. I cried out in dismay and soon attracted the attention of the duty nurse. Thankfully, I was no longer a living skeleton. My body weight, fat, and muscle had all been miraculously restored. I was pleased to find my physical body back to normal, but I still felt very weak. The doctor explained that I seemed to be suffering from the symptoms of malnutrition, even though I appeared well-fed and otherwise in good health. He didn't have an explanation for why I ended up in an ambulance, and neither did I. I certainly didn't want to tell the doctor what I had experienced during my terrifying walk through Dublin city centre. I reckon they would have committed me if I told them the truth. In the end, the doctor said I was likely suffering from stress and exhaustion. They said they'd do more tests and keep me in for a couple of days for observation. I hoped that would be the end of it, and I would soon be home and back to normality. Honestly, I might have written the whole incident off as I did with the previous encounter in Mayo. But early the next morning, I received an unexpected visitor to my bedside. I opened my eyes shortly after 6 a.m. and found him standing over me. My shock was considerable as my jaw dropped, and I shot up from my bed. My visitor was instantly recognizable. A thin man in ragged clothes who somehow possessed a powerful presence as he stood tall in that hospital ward. I couldn't deny the truth any longer. This was the same individual I'd encountered on the street the previous night and on the foothills of Mayo 3 years before. I suppose I should have been concerned, given the horrors I'd been subjected to following our most recent interaction. But I wasn't scared or even angry at that moment, because I looked up to see the friendly smile on my visitor's crusty lips and the kindness in his eyes. Clearly, he hadn't come here to harm me, but I still needed answers from the stranger. "Who are you?" I asked weakly. "And what do you want with me?" My visitor nodded his head and answered in a calm and composed voice. "My original name is lost in the shrouds of time and is of little importance. In truth, I am no longer a mortal man or an individual. Instead, I represent the countless thousands who have suffered and died upon our beloved Emerald Isle." He paused briefly, maintaining an intense eye contact with me as he let those words sink in. "My purpose is to test the mortal souls who cross my path. As you may have guessed, you are one of those souls. You passed the first test all those years ago in the beautiful county of Mayo. On that occasion, you had so little but chose to share your bread with me. Alas, your behavior last night was less than satisfactory." I broke eye contact, suddenly feeling an intense guilt and shame. "I'm sorry," I muttered under my breath. "I should have treated you better." Looking up sheepishly, I expected to see anger in his hollow eyes, but instead I only witnessed kindness. "I'm sorry you had to suffer as you did last night," he continued, "but this was necessary to bring empathy back into your heart. I've delivered the message, good sir. I hope you'll remember this lesson in the future." I couldn't help but feel like a child being told off by the teacher, and this stung a bit. Nevertheless, I couldn't help but admit he was right, and I did fear what the stranger could do to me, given the extent of his powers. I won't forget," I replied nervously. "I'll do better." The hungry man's grin widened in satisfaction as he said, "Very good, sir, until we meet again." And, with a blink of an eye, he was gone, disappearing into thin air whilst leaving me baffled and alone in my hospital bed. I completed some research after my final encounter with the strange entity in the Dublin hospital ward. I learned about the Fear Gorda, a phantom who has stalked the land since the days of the Great Famine. They call the Hunger Man a myth, but I know better. They say the phantom will grant good luck to generous individuals, and I can attest to this, given the success and wealth I obtained after Mayo. But there's a lesser-known dark side to the legend. If a selfish soul refuses or disrespects the phantom, he will make you suffer his fate, reducing a healthy man to a starving husk in mere seconds. There's a lesson here, I'm sure, that we should be grateful for what we have and look out for those less fortunate. Surely, this is why the Fear Gorda continues to stalk our lands, and his message cannot be ignored. I hope you enjoyed The Hunger Man by Finn McCool as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Finn-McCool. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/FINN-MCCOOL. Finn does not have his own website, but he would direct you to take a look at the books written by a good friend of his who seems to have a bevy of names himself. As for the books, they include Tales of the Hellscapes and many shades of terror, with more to enjoy as well. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author, as well as all of our authors who provided us with stories tonight. And thank you to Malcolm Blackwood for his evening's tale.
I think I may have learned something tonight about the nature of folklore, its effects on history, and the horrors that lurk in the corners of our minds. Though I'll be darned if I can remember what it is I actually learned.
Now, before we go, we'd also like to take a moment to thank you personally for joining us on this episode of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. If you enjoyed what you've heard on today's program, please take a moment to stop by our iTunes page or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts and leave us a 5-star review and a kind word. It makes a huge difference and would mean a lot to us. If you'd like to hear a premium extended edition of tonight's and all of our other episodes featuring Twice the Terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can purchase season passes for this podcast and our other quality storytelling programs. Or become a patron for as little as $5 a month and get access to our entire audio archive dating back to 2012, and all of it is ad-free. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, or X, Instagram, or YouTube, you can follow and subscribe to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all of our latest updates and new releases and have the chance to interact with us each and every week. You can subscribe to me on YouTube as well at the Otis Jiry channel, where you'll find releases of my series, Horror Storytime, dating back 10 years now to 2014. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, or X, and Instagram too. Just search for Otis Jiry. And as for my neighbor,
Good evening to you, and with a tip of my hat, I wish you only the sweetest nightmares.
until next week, stay spooky. Get some sleep, if you can. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's otis@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.